We come now to the final lecture in this series on the New Pauline perspective. When I began this series, in the first particularly couple of lectures, I tried to stay pretty much neutral to the two sides of the Reformation theology on one hand and the New Pauline perspective on the other, showing where they differ, how they compare with each other. I did offer the critique, which is largely based upon what others have said about the new perspective. And then in the previous lecture, in this lecture, I'm giving more of a personal response and how I have myself come to grips with the new perspective and wrestled with some of its ideas. I should say right here at the beginning, something that I actually said earlier, but I need to underscore it once again. And that is that all of the new perspective thinkers are not necessarily in lockstep with each other. There are variations among the new Pauline perspective thinkers, and some will be more extreme in their conclusions, some will be more moderate in their conclusions. So what I have to say here today, it needs to be borne in mind that I may be talking about some, but not all, within the new perspective wing of thinking. But at least this is why I would say I cannot fully embrace the new Pauline perspective, even though there are some areas in which I would agree with them. While I think the new perspective thinkers have emphasized some very important ideas in Paul that have sometimes been neglected or missed, or perhaps underemphasized, still there are a number of areas where it seems to me that the new Pauline perspective pushes beyond what I can actually accept myself as a thinker and as a Christian theologian. Some of their theological claims, it appears to me, to be somewhat out of balance with the larger picture of the New Testament. And some of their exegetical claims seem to ignore what seem to me, at least, to be clear meanings in the Greek text of the Greek New Testament. And particularly since some of them are based upon ambiguities, I think we need to always be careful, especially careful, where we are dealing with ambiguities, particularly the ambiguities of genitive phrases. And we don't want to fall into the logical fallacy in which one side says, if you can't prove me wrong, then I must be right. That isn't necessarily so. An ambiguity is just what it is. It is an ambiguity. And it means that you cannot hang the kind of weight on an ambiguity that you might hang on a clear statement. So in general, I guess I would have to say I agree with the critique by outsiders that we covered earlier, that you cannot extract out of Paul's letters the basic idea that in the gospel he is talking about individual salvation. It doesn't seem to me to be feasible or reasonable to talk about salvation simply in terms of the group. If a person is justified by believing the gospel, you don't believe something as a group, you believe something as a person. And it seems to me that to extract the personal dimension out of this whole idea of justification and faith and so on is probably a wrong direction. In any case, let's look at some of the specific issues with which I would have some problems. First of all, the conclusion that the phrase righteousness of God must be taken as a subjective genitive is at best unclear. To be sure, in the medieval period, it was taken as a subjective genitive. Then Luther and the Reformers took it as an objective genitive. And now the new Pauline perspective has gone back to taking it as a subjective genitive. Although, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the new Pauline perspective does not adopt the theology of the medieval period, even though they are going to understand this phrase grammatically as a subjective genitive. But it would seem to me that the concept of righteousness is equally applied both to God's character and as a gift to those who believe. In other words, the phrase righteousness of God is not either or. It's not either entirely relegated to the character of God, the covenant faithfulness of God, or relegated to the gift of righteousness to those who believe. But in fact, depending on the passage in question, sometimes it does seem to refer to God's character, and sometimes it refers to the gift that God gives to those who believe. Certainly when Paul talks about the sacrifice of Christ in Romans 3, verses 25 and 26, he seems to use the term righteousness of God to refer to the character of God, that the sacrifice of Christ was made in order to show God's righteous character. And earlier in the same chapter, when he uses the word pistis, he seems to be using the word pistis in the sense of faithfulness, not simply in the sense of faith. And the faithfulness of God as the covenant God stands in opposition to the unfaithfulness of Israel. At the same time, the idea of righteousness as something that God gives to sinners because of their faith seems to be very clearly stated in quite a number of passages in the Pauline letters. Probably the most emphatic of those is Romans 5:17, where Paul actually uses the phrase, the gift of righteousness. Here, this is not in some sort of an ambiguous genitive expression in Greek. This is a very clear and unambiguous statement that God gives the gift of righteousness. So the ambiguous genitive, which you first run into in Romans 1, verse 17, and then some other places, theoretically, of course, this can go in either direction. Grammatically, there's no way to pin it down and say it must be either this or that. Either of those are possible. But it would seem to me that in the larger context of Paul's discussion of salvation in the letter to the Romans, I think the case is pretty strong that Luther was correct in taking this as an objective genitive rather than a subjective genitive. And I'll add one grammatical addendum to that, something that isn't very obvious to the English reader, but is very obvious to the reader in Greek. And that is that the phrase righteousness of God in Romans 1 is in fact anarthrous, which is to say it does not have a definite article. When Paul speaks in Romans 1:17 about the righteousness of God, we tend to read that in our English translations as the righteousness of God. In fact, the word the is not there. There is no definite article. It is really a righteousness of God, or you could possibly translate it simply as God's righteousness. Most English versions add the definite article the for English smoothness. Now, grammatically speaking, anarthrous constructions in Greek aren't always indefinite. And any Greek reader worth his salt will be aware of that. Sometimes, just because there is not a definite article, doesn't necessarily mean that the phrase is not definite. But very often, anarthrous constructions are used to refer to a member of a class in Greek. In the case of a righteousness of God, which we are talking about, it would seem to me that this righteousness very well may indicate the member of a class, especially in this larger argument of Romans, where it is often contrasted with righteousness by law, or righteousness that is self-established, or righteousness that is by obedience. And it would seem to me that the idea of righteousness as an objective genitive, the righteousness that God gives, stands very well as a member of a class. And so when Paul speaks of God demonstrating, when he speaks of a righteousness of God that is demonstrated by faith, it would seem to me that an objective genitive is better suited to that phrase than perhaps a subjective genitive. I will concede, however, that this is an ambiguity. And as I said earlier, it's inappropriate to lay too much weight on an ambiguity in the Greek text. The second thing I want to talk about is imputation. The effort to dismiss the idea of imputed righteousness seems to me to directly conflict with the basic definition of logizomai, which is the Greek verb to reckon something or to credit something or to impute something, especially when it is used directly concerning righteousness itself. Now, in Paul's discussion of Abraham, God counts Abraham righteous. He credits Abraham with righteousness. He reckons him righteous. This is because he believed in God. Abraham believed God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. So if that reckoning is understood to be a gift, a grace gift, in fact, the word charis is what is used in the Greek text, he is particularly pointing out that this is something opposed to being earned. So if you receive this righteousness without earning it, you receive it as an act of grace, it's very hard for me to see how such a gift can be understood in any way other than as imputation. And in fact, I would agree with the older King James Version translation, where it actually uses the word imputed as the translation of logizomai. The same is true concerning the same phrase that's used about David in Romans 4, verse 6, where it says God credits or God imputes righteousness apart from works. God reckons righteousness apart from works. And, of course, the point of this whole argument in Romans 4 is that in the end, God imputes righteousness to those who believe in the same way that he imputed righteousness to Abraham. He reckons righteousness to those who believe the gospel. With respect to the idea of justification, I am uneasy with this whole idea of redefining justification so that it primarily refers merely to legitimizing Gentiles within the Jewish covenant. Granted, the idea of justification can have a nuance similar to that, but I think its stronger nuance is the idea of acquittal, and the forensic character of this metaphor, I think, is pretty strong. And so replacing the definition of justification as something other than the acquittal of sin seems to me to be unwarranted. The verb dikaiō, which is the Greek word to justify, is directly connected with sin and moral accountability. And this doesn't just happen in a place or two. This happens repeatedly in the letters of Paul, where justification is directly connected to sin. Well, if it is connected to sin, then that doesn't seem to fit very well with the idea that it is simply legitimizing Gentiles to be within the Jewish covenant. Believers, for instance, are justified by Christ's blood precisely so they can be saved from divine wrath. And that, again, doesn't seem to be just an issue of a boundary marker. In the discussion of Abraham, who's justified by faith rather than by works, it's very hard to see how this qualifies as an identity badge, at least for Abraham. Abraham isn't trying to belong to a group. He isn't justified in order to belong to a group. There is no group. Abraham is the first one. He is the father of the faithful. So to take the idea of justification as simply an identity badge in a context with Abraham where there is no community to which to belong seems to me to be stretching things too far. And I would say that it is to the point that the character of Abraham's justification comes from the God who, as Paul will say, justifies the ungodly. And that seems oriented more towards sinfulness, not simply some kind of identity marker. Then there's the ambiguity in the genitive phrase through faithfulness of Christ, or through faith of Christ, depending on which way you want to translate it. Both of those are possible. However, I am unwilling to overthrow the major English translations of this, which is through the faith of Christ or faith in Christ. Now, as you will notice, almost all of the English versions are going to render this as an objective genitive, faith in Christ. The one major exception is the NET, which is an online translation, and they render it as the faithfulness of Christ or Christ's faithfulness. And of course, the older King James Version is simply neutral. It says faith of Christ. And so it leaves the reader to make his own decisions about that. But I think that the major English versions are correct in translating this through faith in Christ. And perhaps it is worth pointing out that this is not only true in translations which were made largely by Protestant scholars. This is also true of translations that were made by Roman Catholic scholars, such as the New American Bible or the New Jerusalem Bible. All of them are going to use this idea of faith in Christ as the best rendering of this genitive. So, I should, of course, in fairness, point out, you can't just simply tally up translations like a popular vote. This isn't a democratic election of some sort. But I would still say that the burden of proof is on the exception rather than the norm. Then we have the issue of substitutionary atonement. Now, there's been a considerable amount of debate, particularly in the last several decades, between what is called the Christus Victor version of atonement and penal satisfaction or substitutionary atonement. And some of this goes all the way back to Anselm 1,000 years ago, some of it to the Swedish theologian Allen, which is some decades ago. I would argue that there are strong exegetical grounds for the concept of substitution and substitutionary atonement. But I would also state that these two emphases do not need to be understood as mutually exclusive. Here, I would agree with N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright, for instance, argues that in the Gospels, the theme is Christus Victor, Christ's victory over the powers of darkness, culminating, of course, in his resurrection from the dead, while the emphasis in the letters of Paul is more on the idea of substitutionary atonement. But as N.T. Wright himself says, these two ideas do not need to try to cancel each other out. They can both be very true. And in that sense, I would agree with Dr. Wright that both of these are features of the message of the cross of Christ. So there will be some New Perspective theologians who do not deny substitutionary atonement. And I would have no argument with them. I would have my argument primarily with those who try to extract substitutionary atonement from the theology of Paul. And this is why. Paul certainly conceives of salvation within the larger context of Israel's sacrificial system. So for Paul, salvation is based upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Frequently, Paul is going to use the word blood as a synecdoche for Jesus' death. In other words, rather than using the word death or the cross of Christ, he uses both of those words too. But often he just simply uses the word blood. And that suggests sacrifice, because the whole idea of many of the major sacrifices in Israel's sacrificial system was the shedding of blood. And in fact, although Paul doesn't say it, it's probably worth pointing out that whoever wrote the letter to the Hebrews will say, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. I think Paul would agree with that sentiment, although I don't think Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews, but I do think that he would agree with that sentiment. In any case, Paul is going to use two critical Greek prepositions in talking about the work of Christ. One of them is the preposition peri, which means for something or concerning something, and the other is the Greek preposition huper, which means in behalf of. Now, the second of these Paul uses more than the first one, but both of them point to the same idea. In the first one, Paul is going to say Christ died for sin. In other words, his death was not only his victory over the powers of evil, it was for sin or concerning sin. And especially the preposition huper, in behalf of. Christ died for the ungodly, or he died in behalf of the ungodly. Or, as Paul will say in another passage, Christ died for us, or Christ died in behalf of us. And again, this is something Paul says a number of times in his letters. So it would seem to me that these prepositions have to be understood in the sense of substitution. The idea of something in behalf of someone else carries with it implicitly the idea of substitution. And I think it points to the idea that all humans owe a life debt because of their alienation and rebellion against God. And that life debt is satisfied in the death of Jesus on the cross. Now, concerning the works of the law, a number of the new Pauline perspective thinkers have said that the term works of the law does not refer to a way of salvation, but rather to simply identity markers as to who is in and who is on the outside. Theoretically, I would say that yes, that is possible, but I also think that that's a questionable construction. The larger context of Paul's letters seem very much oriented towards salvation. And if by works of the law, he's only speaking about identity markers, that would seem to go against the general flow of the larger arguments that he's using in his letters. And it would be the exception rather than the norm. Furthermore, when we come to the one outside text that uses the phrase works of the law, this would be the Qumran text, of which I showed you a rather imperfect photo later, and a little bit about it. There are several copies of this text from Qumran, but they all say essentially the same thing. When we read MMT as referring to legalistic salvation, or reading it as referring to identity marks, it would seem to me that the contrast between what MMT says and the contrast with what Paul says is very, very sharp. And it would seem to me that, in fact, this probably does refer to legalistic salvation. MMT says the works of the law will be reckoned to you as righteousness. Paul's assertion, of course, is that faith and not the works of the law is reckoned to you as righteousness. So those are very sharp contrast. So in my thinking, at least, the idea that the works of the law were perceived by many Jews to be the way of salvation, I actually think that holds. And to read them as identity markers only is not convincing to me. And then there's the idea of the individual versus the group. And once again, I should point out that not all New Perspective theologians eliminate the individual, but some of them do. So in reducing this emphasis on the individual, the New Perspective thinkers can leave ambiguous just how a person is to be saved. A person who is saved isn't saved, it would seem to me, in terms of a group. He is saved by his faith in Jesus Christ. Furthermore, the idea of the group here at least cracks open the door toward universalism. Now, please understand, I am not accusing all New Perspective thinkers of being universalists. That would be unfair and untrue. But on the other hand, the emphasis on the group does seem to crack open that door a bit. That because of Christ's resurrection and exaltation, the Gentiles are now in, whereas before they were out. But if you adopt that position, which tends toward universalism, that certainly is going to cut any missionary effort of the church, because there's no need to do it if you're already in. One thing I would like to point out is the emphatic first person singular that Paul uses to refer to his own experience of grace and faith. In Galatians, he says, "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God." Now, to be sure, when Paul refers to himself in the first person singular, there's no doubt that he's using himself as an example to refer generally to all other people. But the fact that he does this in the first person singular makes it hard for me to believe that he's only speaking generally and not about himself. I think he is speaking about himself, and he's speaking about himself as one single person in view of the sacrifice of Christ for his sins. Finally, the issue of Jewish salvation. Again, this is not monolithic among New Perspective thinkers that the Jews should be exempt from evangelism. This is the view of some New Perspective thinkers. But at least with regard to that idea, if the Jews were already in by divine gracious choice, then why would Paul even worry about trying to convince them of the messiahship of Jesus? And particularly link the belief in his messiahship to the idea of being saved. If they're already in, whether Jesus is the Messiah or not, in a sense, is almost beside the point, because they're already in. So, as Paul himself is going to put it, the gospel is first of all to the Jew. This is where he starts preaching the message of the gospel. And in his preaching, he certainly includes the children of Abraham, to whom the message of salvation has been sent. That seemed to suggest that the people of Israel, the children of Abraham by pedigree, just as much need to hear the message of salvation as does anyone else. And in fact, in Luke's record of Paul's missionary work, very consistently, Luke is going to describe Paul as visiting synagogues in virtually every city that he went to, at least if they had a synagogue, and in those he preached Christ. And in that preaching of Christ, Luke says Paul's message is that through this man, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed. That, again, sounds like he is preaching a message of salvation to the Jews. And in fact, one passage is even more probably pronounced, in which Paul's response to Jewish rejection was, "Your blood be on your own heads." That sounds like it's an issue of salvation, and that the Jews need to hear the message of salvation as much as anyone else. And this is buttressed in particular in Paul's deep anguish for his, as he calls them, kinsmen according to the flesh. Rather pointedly, Paul says he's very grieved that many of his kinsmen have not recognized the messiahship and lordship of Jesus, and he wants them to do so, as he says himself, that they might be saved. So it would seem to me that there is as much cause for Jewish evangelism as there is cause for Gentile evangelism. In fact, in the Roman letter, Paul is going to conclude that both Jew and Gentile are under sin, and therefore both of them need to hear the saving message of Jesus Christ. So, at the end of the day, I can appreciate a number of the features of the New Pauline perspective, as I enumerated in the previous lecture, and alluded to a couple of them in this lecture. I continue to respect many of the scholars who embrace the new perspective. I have high respect for the scholarly work of James Dunn and for the scholarly work of N.T. Wright. At the same time, I may not be on the same page with them about everything, but I don't feel that I need to conclude that they're heretics, even though I might disagree with them. But I will say that I do disagree at some critical points in at least the general reading of St. Paul in the New Pauline perspective. And these are the points that I've tried to enumerate in this lecture today. So everyone is going to have to come to terms themselves with the assertions and conclusions of the New Pauline perspective and how that relates to the theology of the Reformation period in the larger Christian church. I guess what I would advise is that you take the approach that is described in the book of Acts about the Bereans. They searched the scriptures to see whether these things were so, and I advise you to do the same. Thank you for sharing with me in these lectures.